Hollywood legends are born from moments of transformation, but rarely does a single photograph possess the power to shatter a man's entire world and rebuild him anew. In 1964, John Wayne stood at the pinnacle of his career, the undisputed king of the Western genre, when one image would arrive at his doorstep and change everything. What happened next would transform not just the Duke himself, but the very soul of American cinema. This is the story of the day John Wayne walked back onto a movie set a completely different man, and the haunting truth behind the photograph that made it all possible. The year was 1964, and John Wayne's name blazed across movie marquees like a promise of American glory. At 57 years old, Marion Morrison, the man the world knew as the Duke, commanded Hollywood with an iron fist wrapped in a leather glove. His recent triumph in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance had cemented his status as more than just an actor. He was America's moral compass. Wrapped in cowboy boots and a 10-gallon hat dot behind the gates of his Newport Beach mansion, Wayne lived like the king he had become. The walls were adorned with movie posters bearing his likeness, each one a testament to a career that had spanned over 3 decades. His study, lined with scripts and correspondence from the most powerful men in Hollywood, served as the war room where future legends were planned. Yet beneath this carefully constructed empire of masculine bravado, cracks had begun to show. Those closest to Wayne whispered about the drinking that had intensified since his divorce from Josephine Scenes. The legendary parties at his home had grown darker, more desperate. Studio executives who once cowered before his presence now spoke in hushed tones about the Duke's increasingly erratic behavior on set. But none dared confront the man who had single-handedly shaped the Western genre. The morning of March 15th, 1964, began like any other for Wayne. He stood on the terrace of his mansion, overlooking the Pacific Ocean, coffee in hand, preparing for another day of filming Circus World with Rita Hayworth. The script lay open beside him, marked with his characteristic red pen annotations. Everything seemed perfectly orchestrated, just as it always had been. Little did the world know that within hours, a single piece of mail would arrive that would shatter this carefully constructed reality forever. The photograph that lay waiting in his morning correspondence would not just change John Wayne, it would reveal the man he truly was beneath decades of Hollywood. Mythology. The morning mail arrived at Wayne's Newport Beach estate at precisely 10:30 a.m., as it had every day for the past 15 years. His longtime housekeeper, Maria Santos, a woman who had witnessed the rise and fall of countless Hollywood marriages, carried the silver tray of correspondence to Wayne's study with the same reverence she reserved for sacred rituals. Among the usual assortment of fan letters, studio contracts, and society invitations, one envelope stood apart. It bore no return address, yet something about its weight, its texture, commanded attention. The paper felt different, heavier, more substantial than the typical Hollywood correspondence that filled Wayne's days. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper with the care reserved for precious artifacts, lay a single black and white photograph dot as Wayne's fingers peeled away the protective tissue. The image that emerged would haunt him for the rest of his days. It was a photograph from the Korean War, dated 1950, an image that had somehow escaped the careful curation of his public persona. In it, a young Marine sergeant, bloodied and exhausted, carried a wounded comrade across a bomb-cratered landscape. The soldier's face, though marked by war and suffering, was unmistakably familiar. Wayne's hands began to tremble as he studied the photograph. This wasn't just any war hero. This was Michael Morrison, his own son from his first marriage, a son he had barely acknowledged, a boy who had enlisted to escape his father's shadow and prove himself worthy of the Wayne name. The accompanying letter, written in Michael's own hand shortly before his death in combat, contained just 4 words that would echo through Wayne's soul. "I tried, Dad. Goodbye." The room seemed to spin as the full weight of revelation crashed down upon the Duke. For over a decade, he had convinced himself that his estranged son was simply another casualty of his Hollywood lifestyle, another relationship sacrificed on the altar of fame. The truth that Michael had died a hero's death while Wayne played cowboys on sound stages shattered every foundation of the man he believed himself to be. Michael Morrison had lived his entire life as a ghost in his father's empire. Born in 1932, during Wayne's first marriage to Josephine Scenes, the boy had grown up watching his father transform from Marion Morrison into the mythical John Wayne, witnessing firsthand how Hollywood could consume a man's soul and leave nothing but carefully crafted personas in its wake. While Wayne conquered the silver screen with tales of heroism and honor, Michael struggled with a different kind of battle, the war for his father's attention, approval, and love. Teachers at the exclusive Beverly Hills preparatory schools he attended knew him only as the Duke's boy, a label that followed him like a shadow. His classmates either worshipped him for his famous lineage or resented him for the privilege they assumed came with it. The truth was far more complex and heartbreaking. Wayne, consumed by the demands of his burgeoning career and the intoxicating power of stardom, had become increasingly absent from his son's life. Birthday parties were missed for location shoots, graduation ceremonies skipped for premiere events. Michael learned to measure his father's love not in presence, but in absence, in the empty chairs at school plays and the signed photographs that arrived in place of actual conversations. By 1950, at the age of 18, Michael had made a decision that would define the rest of his short life. Unable to compete with the celluloid heroes his father portrayed, he chose to become one in reality. Against his mother's tearful protests, and without his father's knowledge, Michael enlisted in the United States Marine Corps under an assumed name, determined to earn the respect he could never gain as John Wayne's son. The Korean War provided Michael with the stage he needed to prove himself. Letters home, carefully hidden from Wayne by his mother, told the story of a young man finding his identity in the crucible of combat. Fellow Marines knew him simply as Sergeant Morrison, a leader who volunteered for the most dangerous missions, who carried wounded comrades to safety, who embodied every heroic ideal his father had only pretended to possess on camera. The Battle of Heartbreak Ridge in October 1951 would become Michael Morrison's final performance. Though no cameras rolled to capture his greatest acting achievement, a transformation from Hollywood legacy into genuine American hero. The photograph that would later devastate his father was taken during those final, desperate hours of combat. Michael's unit had been pinned down by enemy fire for 3 days, their supplies dwindling, their hope fading with each passing hour. It was then that Private Jimmy Collins, barely 19 and terrified beyond measure, took shrapnel to his chest and legs. As enemy bullets whistled overhead and artillery shells exploded around them, Michael made the decision that would define his legacy and break his father's heart. The war correspondent who captured the photograph, a seasoned veteran named Robert Chun, would later describe the scene with tears in his eyes. "I've seen courage in many forms, but what that young Marine did, carrying his wounded buddy across 200 yards of open ground while under heavy fire, that was something beyond heroism. That was love made manifest in the face of certain death." Michael didn't know that Sean's camera had captured his act of valor. He was focused entirely on Jimmy Collins, whose labored breathing and fading pulse marked time in a way no Hollywood director ever could. As they reached the relative safety of a bombed-out bunker, Collins whispered his thanks before losing consciousness. Michael held his position, returning fire and protecting the wounded soldier until the enemy assault finally broke. But victory came at a price that no amount of box office success could ever repay. A sniper's bullet found its mark 3 hours later, as Michael attempted to signal for medical evacuation. He died as he had lived those final months, not as John Wayne's son, but as Michael Morrison, United States Marine, a man who had found his identity not in his father's shadow, but in the light of his own courage. The letter that accompanied the photograph to Wayne's mansion had been written during those final hours in the bunker, penned by candlelight as Michael watched over his wounded comrade. In it, he expressed no bitterness, no resentment, only a son's enduring love for a father who had never truly seen him. The grandfather clock in. Wayne's study struck noon as he finished reading Michael's final letter for the 3rd time. The words swam before his eyes, each sentence a dagger thrust into the carefully constructed mythology of his life. The man who had built an empire on playing heroes suddenly found himself face to face with a real one, and it was the son he had failed to know, failed to love, failed to save. Wayne's legs gave out beneath him, and he sank into his leather chair, the same chair where he had read countless scripts about fathers and sons, about honor and sacrifice, about the very virtues his own son had embodied while Wayne merely pretended to possess them. The irony was so brutal, so perfectly crafted, that it felt like divine punishment delivered through the medium of celluloid dreams. Maria Santos, the housekeeper who had raised Wayne's children more faithfully than he ever had, found him there. An hour later, the powerful man who commanded respect from studio heads and government officials sat broken, clutching a photograph and weeping like a lost child. She had seen Wayne at his highest highs and lowest lows, but never had she witnessed such complete devastation. "Senator Wayne," she whispered, approaching carefully. "The studio called. They are waiting for you on set." The words seemed to reach him from across an ocean of grief. Wayne looked up, his eyes red with tears and something deeper, a recognition of truths too long buried beneath layers of Hollywood veneer. "My son," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "My son was a hero, Maria, a real hero, and I never knew." The photograph trembled in his weathered hands as the full weight of his failure crashed down upon him. All those years playing the strong, silent American patriarch, and his own son had died unknown, unacknowledged, unloved by the father who could have learned true strength from him. That afternoon, John Wayne was scheduled to film the climactic scene of Circus World, a moment where his character reconciles with his estranged daughter. The script called for tears, for genuine emotion, for a vulnerability that Wayne had always struggled to access on camera. Little did the cast and crew know that when he walked onto that set, he would be carrying the greatest performance of his life, not as an actor, but as a man finally awakening to the person he needed to become. The gates of Paramount Studios had witnessed countless transformations over the decades. Unknown actors becoming stars, stars fading into obscurity, careers rising and falling like the California sun. But they had never witnessed anything quite like what occurred when John Wayne's black Cadillac pulled through them at 3:47 p.m. on that fateful March afternoon. Studio security guards, accustomed to Wayne's commanding presence, barely recognized the man who emerged from the vehicle. Gone was the swagger, the confidence, the larger-than-life persona that had intimidated directors and inspired co-stars. In its place walked a man carrying the weight of genuine grief, genuine remorse, genuine humanity for the first time in decades. The walk from the parking lot to Sound Stage 7 took Wayne past a gallery of movie posters featuring his own image, promotional materials for The Searchers, Rio Bravo, The Quiet Man. Each poster seemed to mock him now, these carefully crafted images of a man playing roles his own son had lived and died embodying. The distance to the soundstage felt longer than any cattle drive, more treacherous than any movie stunt he had ever performed. Word of Wayne's unusual behavior had already